A velvet painting that whispers of ghosts, a forgotten castle across a Venetian lake, and a murder born not of rage, but of inheritance, illusion, and pride. In this case, the truth came wrapped in elegance and deception, where art concealed ambition, and the past refused to stay buried. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Settle in, because this mystery begins now. When a man shows up at the brownstone wearing a cobalt silk scarf and dragging a wooden crate that looked like it had just lost a fistfight with customs, you expect trouble. Or worse, performance art. I had just returned from an errand involving a lopsided hat rack and one of Wolfe's more obscure orchid sprays when I heard the buzzer. The door opened to reveal a gent whose hair was as lacquered as his shoes, both of which gleamed like bad omens. "Mr. Wolfe is expecting me," he said, which of course was nonsense. "Name?" I asked. "Felix Hartwell. I've just returned from Venice. Urgently." The crate creaked ominously as he dragged it across the foyer, giving Fritz in the kitchen a visible facial twitch. "That stays on the rug," I warned. But Hartwell was already halfway to the office, eyes darting like he expected someone to shoot through the stained glass window. Wolfe, naturally, looked up with the enthusiasm of a man asked to dance at a tax audit. "Archie," he said, eyes narrowing, "why is that in my house?" Hartwell placed a trembling hand on the crate and said, softly but clearly, "What's inside has already killed once." Now that was a decent opener. Wolfe did not stand. That would have required either a fire alarm or a government subpoena. But his eyes, those dark, bored, beer-loving eyes, took in the crate as if it had personally offended him. "Mr. Hartwell," he said with sluggish disdain, "this is not a customs inspection office." "I understand," Hartwell said, "but this is not a customs problem. It's a curse." Archie Goodwin, that's me, doesn't usually flinch at words like curse. We get more than our fair share of haunted typewriters and vengeful heiresses. But the way he said it, soft, shaky, like a man who wanted to be laughed at and disproved at the same time, well, it was just unsettling enough. He unlatched the crate. A waft of varnish, old velvet, and something less agreeable drifted out. He pulled aside a swath of burgundy cloth, revealing a portrait in oil, 17th century maybe. A pale man with hawk-like cheekbones and ice-chip eyes stared back at us from within an opulent frame carved with acanthus leaves and decay. "I took it from a castle," Hartwell whispered. "A villa that stands above the Venetian lake. Locals say it was sealed for 100 years. When I opened the chamber, this was resting on the hearth." Wolfe shifted his weight, which, for him, is the emotional equivalent of a gasp. I blinked. "So naturally, you took it home?" Hartwell nodded. "And since then, someone's followed me. Or something." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "Who else knows this painting is here?" Hartwell settled into the red armchair like a man expecting a séance. The crate sat between us like an unwanted guest. I perched on the edge of my chair, ready to field flying wine bottles or spirit apparitions, whichever came first. "The castle is called Rocca di Velluno," he began. "It overlooks a lake so still the locals call it Lo Specchio dell'Anima, the mirror of the soul." "Charming," I muttered. "It was once owned by a noble family, all gone now. Rumors said there were documents, hidden deeds, inheritance claims, maybe even gold, but none were found." He paused to let the ghostly weight settle. It didn't. I bought the property in cash through an agent. One wing was sealed behind a false wall. I had it opened. This painting was the only item inside, set perfectly upright, untouched by dust. "Also untouched by common sense," I offered. Hartwell ignored me. 2 days later, my fixer was dead. They said it was a stroke, but he was 39 and built like a gondolier. He was a gondolier, he added, before he helped me. He pulled a worn photograph from his coat. It showed a man face down in a Venetian courtyard, limbs askew, a fedora rolled to the side. It wasn't art gallery material. My flight back was delayed by a customs hold. Then I noticed someone watching my hotel. Every cab I take, I see the same hat. And now, he nodded at the portrait. I think something came with it. Wolfe, having endured this tale of spectral pursuit with the pained stoicism of a man sitting through an overcooked soufflé, finally stood. Not all the way. Just enough to lean forward and regard the painting like it might belch fire. "It is not haunted," he said flatly. "It is oiled. Recently." "Of course it's oiled," Hartwell protested. "It's been—" "No," Wolfe interrupted, voice clipped. "The oil is synthetic, American, from the last 3 months. This frame was touched up post-removal, and poorly." I gave it a closer look. I don't have Wolfe's nose. God help me if I ever do. But even I could smell something more paint store than Piazza. "I don't care for stories of ghosts, Mr. Hartwell," Wolfe said, returning to his chair. "They are the refuge of melodramatics and amateurs. If you have a legal problem, speak plainly. If you fear for your life, speak truthfully. If you brought me this canvas, hoping to summon spirits, take it to a carnival." "But someone died," Hartwell pleaded. "This thing is dangerous." "Pfui," Wolfe barked. "So is a walnut if you're allergic." I stood. "Shall I show Mr. Hartwell out?" "No," Wolfe said, adjusting his book. "Let the door close itself." Hartwell opened his mouth, then shut it, as if words couldn't do the trick. The portrait watched us all with the faintest smirk. If I were a paranoid man, I'd have sworn it winked. He stood there for a moment, Hartwell did, just inside the threshold, fingers trailing along the edge of the crate like he didn't want to part with it, or like he thought it might snap at his wrist. Then he turned, gave Wolfe a last wounded glance, and said it. Quietly, not loud enough to be dramatic, just low enough to make you lean in. "I brought back more than a painting, Mr. Wolfe," he said. "I brought back a ghost. And now someone wants it dead." And then he was gone, his shoes tapping down the steps like a dying metronome. The front door side closed behind him. I turned to Wolfe. "Well, that was fun." He didn't answer. He didn't reach for his beer. Didn't even reach for the book he'd left half splayed on the armrest like a sleeping cat. He just sat there, frowning at the velvet-covered crate like it had offended his sense of interior design. "You don't believe him," I said, just to be sure. "Of course not." "Then why do you look like you're waiting for thunder?" He sniffed once, then finally reached for his book. The rustle of the pages had a slightly irritated edge. "Because, Archie," he muttered, "men who fabricate ghosts rarely carry the scent of varnish, arsenic, and desperation." I nodded slowly. "So, we're not getting involved?" "Absolutely not." And yet, he didn't pick up where he left off. Not for a long time. That crate stayed in the room like it was listening. Wolfe had returned to his chair with all the grace of a monarch who'd just been reminded he still had subjects. He opened his book but didn't turn a page. His left eyebrow, though, did something that passed for aerobic activity, climbing, hesitating, then settling halfway down like it had second thoughts. "Venetian, you said?" he asked Hartwell, without lifting his gaze. "Castle above a lake," Hartwell replied, clutching his hat as though it might protect him from whatever Wolfe was thinking. Now, I've seen Wolfe dismiss men with bigger titles and better grooming in under 60 seconds. Usually all it takes is one insult to Fritz's food or the word appointment. But this time, Wolfe leaned back. Not out of politeness, mind you, but curiosity, which, in him, is only a few degrees warmer than contempt. "What lake?" Wolfe asked. Hartwell hesitated. "They call it the Mirror of the Soul, north of Venice." That was all it took. Wolfe sighed through his nose, which in our household is the equivalent of a standing ovation. "Archie," he said, "bring the painting here." I blinked. To look at? No. To smell it. Right. Because when things start getting spooky, nothing clears the air like a sniff test. The painting sat on the table like it had something to say, but was too smug to speak first. I brought it over, careful not to drop it, mostly because if I broke a haunted portrait, I figured that'd be the last straw for Wolfe, the ghost, or both. He didn't touch it, not the canvas, not the frame. Instead, he leaned forward and inhaled, nose twitching faintly. He grunted. Hartwell looked hopeful. "Do you smell something?" "I smell methyl ethyl ketone," Wolfe said, "mixed with linseed oil. There's also a trace of urethane." I gave it my best detective squint. "Which tells us what, exactly?" "That whoever refinished this frame wasn't trying to preserve it. They were trying to disguise it." Hartwell blinked. "But it's original. The whole piece was—" "No, it is not," Wolfe snapped. "This wood was sanded and resealed recently. The joinery is inconsistent with 17th century Venetian methods. See the beveling here, too shallow, and here, machine-lathed." "Maybe it was repaired," Hartwell offered weakly. "Perhaps, but not in Italy." Wolfe eased back into his chair, his eyes now sharp and unblinking. "Whatever this is," he said, "it wasn't framed in Italy." And just like that, the painting stopped being historical and started being suspicious. Fritz arrived just then, balancing a tray with the steadiness of a man who had once marched under the imperial flag and now served coffee like it was wartime logistics. He took one step into the office, then stopped cold. "Excuse me," he said, voice tighter than usual. "Is something wrong?" "That depends," I said. "Are we talking metaphysically, chemically, or acoustically?" Fritz didn't smile. His eyes flicked to the crate, then to the painting, and then, oddly, to the far wall. "There was a sound," he said, sotto voce. "In the kitchen vent. I thought it was the boiler." "Was it?" Wolfe asked, not looking up. "No," Fritz said. "It was like wood. Cracking. From below." I raised an eyebrow. "Below, as in the basement?" He nodded. "Or the wine cellar?" Hartwell stiffened, like someone had just rung the castle's bell. "You didn't tell me you had visitors downstairs," I said. I don't," Hartwell muttered. I looked at Wolfe. He hadn't moved, but his fingers had stopped tapping the chair. "Fritz," Wolfe said, "lock the kitchen." Fritz nodded once and vanished like a trained butler in a Gothic novel. So now we had a cursed painting, a frame soaked in varnish, and a basement making ghostly noises. Swell. Wolfe doesn't rise for nonsense. That's one of the fundamental laws of our little brownstone kingdom. But nonsense with a varnish finish? Apparently that's another matter. He stood. Not dramatically, not hurriedly, just enough to lean closer to the frame without letting his dignity collapse. Hartwell watched with breathless awe, as though Wolfe were a surgeon preparing to dissect a secret. Wolfe didn't touch it. He didn't have to. His eyes did the work. "This painting," he said slowly, "is not what it purports to be." Hartwell blinked. "You mean it's a fake?" "I did not say that." I folded my arms. "But you're thinking it." Wolfe ignored me.
The subject appears authentic, the brushwork exquisite, but the treatment, the materials, the frame, the frame, it's all too eager to be genuine, as though someone recreated authenticity from a textbook. Then it's a forgery. Wolfe gave Hartwell a look that could sand varnish. If it's forged, he said, it's brilliant. He stepped back to his chair, lowered himself as if returning to a sacred altar, and added with quiet finality, if it's real, it's bait. And suddenly, it wasn't the painting we were watching. It was the man who brought it. Hartwell sat as if someone had replaced his spine with Venetian lace. He stopped talking, just like that. No protests, no ghost stories, no melodramatic warnings about death following the scent of canvas, which of course made me suspicious. Wolfe remained still. He didn't press. He let the silence do its work, stretching it out like pastry dough until Hartwell began to sweat. "Mr. Hartwell," Wolfe said eventually, "there's something you're omitting." Hartwell didn't reply. "You obtained this painting illegally," Wolfe said. Hartwell flinched. A tiny twitch in the corner of his mouth, but I saw it. "Not necessarily," I said. "He bought the castle. If the painting came with it—" "No," Wolfe interrupted. "There's more. Something not listed on any manifest. Something worth restoring the frame with haste and secrecy." Still nothing from Hartwell. "Smuggling antiquities is an error," Wolfe said. "Smuggling information is a crime." The air in the room had turned thick. Even the orchids seemed to lean in. Wolfe stared at the frame, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You left something behind. Something more valuable than this." Hartwell didn't answer. And that, more than anything, told me Wolfe was right. Whatever had come out of that castle, it wasn't done haunting us yet. It was 8:13 a.m., and I had just taken the first respectable bite out of my rye toast with marmalade, imported, Fritz approved, and ridiculously overpriced, when the phone rang. Wolfe was upstairs tending to his orchids, and I had been enjoying the rare silence of a morning without murder, clients, or metaphysical artwork. That was about to change. "Goodwin," I said into the receiver. "Felix Hartwell is dead," said a voice that belonged to Detective Donahue, a man whose vocabulary typically included grunts, partial license plates, and the phrase "I was just about to call you," which he wasn't. "Cause?" I asked. "Too early. Locked penthouse. No forced entry. No signs of struggle. Just him, in silk pajamas, face down next to a book." "Which book?" Donahue snorted. "Like I noticed. Get down here." He gave me the address, a Fifth Avenue high-rise with enough glass to qualify as a telescope, and hung up. I slid the toast back on the plate, sighed dramatically for an audience of none, and headed
upstairs. "If you're gonna drop dead in style," I muttered to myself, "you might as well do it 15 stories up with the curtains open." And Hartwell, apparently, had done just that. The doorman gave me a once-over, like I was either the man's accountant or his younger brother with a gambling problem. I gave him a card and my best professional irritant smile. The elevator opened directly into Hartwell's penthouse, which was the sort of place that tried too hard to look like it wasn't trying. Plush rugs, walnut paneling, and just enough abstract sculpture to make you think Hartwell had hired someone with a ponytail to decorate. Donahue was there, scowling into a notepad. The air smelled faintly of something floral and chemical, a bad sign. "No broken locks," he said. "No tampered latch. Only one key, on the inside. Chains still secure. Time of death? Coroner's on his way. Windows shut tight. No sign of a break-in." I stepped around the coffee table and took a long look at Hartwell. Silk pajamas, pale complexion, arms askew, face turned toward an open hardback. Something in German. The one thing that wasn't there, the painting. I looked at the wall. Clean. No marks, no dust halo, not even a nail.
"What about that?" I asked, pointing to the wooden crate slumped near the bookshelf. Donahue grunted. "Empty, just the packing straw." I moved closer. The side of the crate had splintered, not inward, outward. I bent down and ran my finger along one of the sharp, bent edges. It looked like something, or someone, had forced its way out. I stood, dusted off my hands, and thought, someone had been here. The problem was, no one could have left. Kramer arrived like thunder on two legs, bulky, red-faced, and already ticked off. He looked around the room, hands on hips, taking it in with the subtlety of a bowling ball in a wine rack. "Suicide," he announced. "Pills, maybe. Or one of those new designer poisons they peddle downtown." I blinked. "Designer poison?" He waved a hand. "You know what I mean." "What I know," I said, "is that you've got no weapon, no note, no open bottle, and no witnesses. Plus, the only door in here is locked from the inside." Kramer gave me the look he reserves for pigeons and private eyes. "And you're here because Wolfe sent you?" "He didn't. Marmalade got cold, so I figured I'd ruin someone else's morning too." Kramer grunted and kicked at the edge of the rug. "Tell your boss he can keep his haunted art theories to himself. This ain't one of his gourmet mysteries. Guy croaks in silk pajamas. We don't need a Latin quotation." "I'll pass that along." He turned back toward the corpse. "Besides, what did you expect? The guy's been acting nuts since he got back from Europe." I looked at the empty wall and thought, if Hartwell poisoned himself, I'll grow orchids out of my typewriter. Donahue was working the minibar, like it owed him money, so I took the liberty of snooping. Wolfe doesn't call it that. He calls it reconnaissance. I call it job security. The windows were all latched, no dust disturbed, drapes drawn. And then I saw it, just a smudge on the windowsill, no longer than my index finger. Blue. Not sky blue, not navy. Something in between, like the blue you'd find on a Venetian canal under clouds, if you were poetic, or prone to hallucinations. I pulled a handkerchief from my pocket and dabbed the smear. Paint. Still tacky. Definitely not from the generic modern art on the other walls. I stood there a moment, trying to remember something Hartwell said. Haunted lake light blue. That was it. The exact hue he had used to describe the cursed portrait's background. The one that had been packed in the crate, then supposedly displayed here. Which begged the question, if the painting was missing, why was its paint on the windowsill? I glanced around the room again. No broken locks, no tampered latch, no intruders. And yet, something had gotten out. Or maybe something had been let in. Either way, I didn't like it. The coroner finally showed up, looking like he'd rather be diagnosing a tax audit. He took one look at Hartwell, muttered something about blood pooling and lividity, then pulled a penlight and leaned in close. "Odd," he said. "Lips are stained." "Blood?" I asked. He shook his head. "No, something red. Not natural. Cherry, maybe." That got my gears turning, which is not something I do lightly before lunch. Back at the brownstone, I gave Wolfe the play-by-play. He listened, eyes half-lidded, steepling his fingers like a cathedral in waiting. When I got to the part about the red lips, he stirred. "Cherry?" he repeated. "Or arsenic?" I offered. Fritz, who had wandered in with a saucer of cookies, paled. "Surely not the Amarena preserve?" he asked. "Doubtful," I said. "This one didn't die happy." That's when the phone rang. It was the coroner. "We found a capsule," he said. "Back molar, half dissolved, deliberately wedged." "Prescription?" "Not unless Bayer makes cherry-flavored death pills." I relayed the news. Wolfe nodded slowly. "So," I said. "Still suicide?" Wolfe closed his eyes. Only if he bit down willingly, which, judging by the look on Hartwell's face, he hadn't. We returned to the brownstone in silence, a rarity I did not squander. Wolfe settled into his chair, his gaze fixed on the floor as if the fibers were rearranging into clues. I waited. No beer, no book, just the ticking of the clock and the faint rattle of Fritz in the kitchen, fussing with dinner prep and possible poison parallels. Finally, Wolfe spoke. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, "we are no longer dealing with a superstition. We are dealing with a theft and a murder." I gave him a look. "So, now you believe in ghosts?" He opened one eye. "Only the kind that leave fingerprints and chemical residues." He leaned forward, resting his hands on the chair arms. "That crate," he said, "was broken from within, splinters bent outward, packing straw forced to the floor." I raised a brow. "So?" He looked up. "Someone opened that crate, from the inside." And just like that, the ghost story got a new chapter. The call came precisely 6 minutes after Wolfe had resumed his seat in the office and resumed pretending I didn't exist. Fritz had just delivered coffee. Sumatran, dark, with a hint of rebellion, and I was about to make a second pass at the newspaper when the phone rang. Wolfe glared at it like it had belched. I answered. "Goodwin." It was Kramer, sounding like someone had just cancelled his meatloaf. "Tell Wolfe the Hartwell case is closed," he barked. "Tox report came in. Cyanogenic capsule, self-administered. No evidence of forced entry, no sign of a struggle. Suicide." "Uh-huh." "Tell him," Kramer continued, "he can get back to pruning his petunias. We don't need any of his dime store ghost stories muddying the file." "Orchids, Inspector," I said cheerfully, "but I'll pass it along." I held out the receiver. Wolfe took it grudgingly. After 10 seconds of clipped silence, he barked, "You are an oaf, sir, a blunt instrument with no edge for inquiry." More silence. Then Wolfe slammed the phone down with a force that made the orchids flinch. "I am not," he declared, "a mortuary cleaner for police bungles." Which was Wolfe speak for, "I hate it when idiots close my murder cases before I've opened them." "I don't get it," I said, pacing the office like a man trying to walk off indigestion. "Guy turns up with a cursed painting, drops dead with a cherry bomb in his mouth, and you're ready to call it a rap because Kramer says so?" Wolfe raised one eyebrow and flipped a page in his book with exaggerated delicacy. The book, I noticed, was not about crime. It was a volume on rare spices from the Maghreb. "Archie," he said without looking up, "we are not retained. We have no client, no legal obligation, and no culinary stake. Therefore, I decline." "Culinary stake?" I repeated. "The man was murdered. There's a missing painting, a broken crate, a colour-matching paint smear, and a corpse with suspicious lips. That doesn't itch your curiosity?" He set the book down with the grace of a man putting a sword back in its scabbard. "Curiosity," he said, "is a faculty for idle men. I am neither idle nor intrigued. You're sulking because the police made the first call." "I am observing boundaries," Wolfe snapped. "Hartwell is dead, the painting is gone, and we have no client." At that moment, Fritz's voice floated in from the hallway. "Lunch is delayed, sir. Miss Hartwell is here." And just like that, the case twitched back to life. She came in wearing a navy coat with buttons like gold coins and an expression that made me stand up before I knew I was doing it. "Miss Hartwell," I said, ushering her in. "Or should I say Ms.? We're equal opportunity here." "Clara," she replied, her voice clear but brittle. "Just Clara." She was younger than I'd expected, late 20s maybe, but with a face that had learned early not to trust mirrors. Her hair was tied back, severe and practical, but her eyes scanned the room like she was expecting someone to lie. She carried a square-wrapped bundle under one arm,
wrapped in butcher paper and tied with kitchen string. I clocked it immediately, too flat for groceries, too rigid for flowers. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, stepping forward, "I know you didn't ask to be involved, but my uncle saw you as his last resort." Wolfe inclined his head a millimeter. "He did not mention you. We were estranged, but he called me 2 days ago. He said he'd made a mistake." She placed the bundle on Wolfe's desk and untied it slowly, reverently. "It belonged to Brillat Savarin," she said, "and it's in French." Which is how you bribe a man like Wolfe. Wolfe didn't move at first, but his eyes, those heavy, skeptical, soup-colored eyes, locked onto the leather cover like a cobra recognizing kin. I stepped closer for a look. The spine was cracked in that appealing old book way, with gilded lettering that shimmered faintly in the office light. The title, Physiologie du goût, édition 1889. "Original?" Wolfe asked, voice already lower by an octave. Clara nodded. "There's marginalia, notes. Some of them, I believe, are from the author himself." Wolfe reached out, not for her, not for thanks, but for the book. He cradled it in both hands like a relic. Fritz, who had been hovering in the doorway, inhaled audibly. I coughed. "Do we need a moment alone, or—" Wolfe ignored me. He opened the cover, turned a page with such tenderness I feared for his blood pressure. Then he closed the book and sat back, holding it across his lap. "If this is genuine," he murmured, "the woman has purchased more than a hearing." Clara said nothing. She didn't need to. Wolfe pressed the tips of his fingers together. "And you believe your uncle did not take his own life?" "I do," she said. "And I think someone wanted what he brought home." Wolfe's eyes closed. And then, like the switch had flipped, "We are employed." It didn't take long after that. Clara recounted everything she knew. Her estrangement, Hartwell's sudden reappearance in her life, the strange phone call about the painting, and his panicked tone when he warned her, "It's not just a painting. It's a promise someone didn't want kept." Wolfe listened in silence, occasionally glancing down at the cookbook as though it might offer commentary. When she finished, he gestured toward the red chair. She sat. "You are now my client," he said, "and I shall treat your claim with the seriousness it requires." "Meaning?" I asked, arms folded. "Meaning," Wolfe said, "Felix Hartwell was murdered. The painting was not merely decorative, and whatever he returned with from Venice is now in the hands of someone willing to kill again." I leaned against the wall, arms still folded. "So what changed your mind? Guilt? Justice? Or the cookbook?" Wolfe reached for his beer and took a deliberate sip. "Guilt is irrelevant. Justice is theoretical, but no man ingests a cherry capsule with veal marsala." I smiled. Case back on the burner. Every murder comes with its own seating chart, and my job was to figure out who was invited, who RSVP'd, and who showed up late with a carving knife. So I started with a list, Felix Hartwell's Venetian Circle, as Wolfe had dubbed it, with a look that implied half of them deserved excommunication. I pulled what I could from phone records, Hartwell's last public appearance at the Maddox Gallery, and 2 hotel guest books that Fritz somehow coaxed from the concierge using nothing more than a coat and a smile. There was Clara, the niece, now officially our client. Giorgio Menzo, rival art dealer and full-time peacock. A part-time courier named Vittorio Siletti, pronounced like a wine you regret ordering. And finally, Mrs. Dubin, the cleaning lady who'd been scrubbing up after dead men since Roosevelt was new. "If anyone in this bunch didn't want Felix Hartwell dead," I told Wolfe, "it's because someone else beat them to it." Wolfe didn't look up from his book. "You will speak to them all. That's the plan. Begin with the girl." She has a name. Yes, Wolfe said dryly. So did the last woman who lied to us. It was going to be that kind of day. We met at a midtown cafe that smelled like burnt sugar and overheard apologies. Clara Hartwell sat across from me with her gloves still on and her tea untouched. She was dressed sharper than she felt, dark coat, silver earrings, and eyes that kept flinching away from mine. "I want to help," she said, "but I really don't know what my uncle was involved in." "Help me anyway," I said. "When did he contact you last?" She hesitated. "The day before he died." "That soon?" She nodded. "He said he'd made a mistake in Venice. That the painting was valuable, yes. But what mattered was what was inside the frame." That perked me up. "Inside how?" "I don't know." He was vague, rambling. He said he shouldn't have brought it back. Her voice cracked, just a little, like the ice in the water glass between us. I leaned back. "Did he say who might want it?" "No names, just, they know." She looked down at her untouched cup, then added softly, "He told me something was inside the frame, something more valuable than the painting itself." That was when I knew Wolfe would call this a pivot point. I just called it trouble with a price tag. Giorgio Menzo greeted me at his Upper East Side gallery with a smile like a knife point and a brandy glass that had never seen a rinse. "Ah, Mr. Goodwin," he said, "still working for the sedentary Sphinx? Still ducking subpoenas?" I replied, stepping inside. He laughed. "Always." Menzo's gallery was all cool lighting and desperate abstracts, the kind of place where you don't know if you're looking at a canvas or the shadow of your regrets. "I heard about Felix," he said, swirling the brandy. "Tragic, but not entirely surprising." "Why's that?" "He was reckless. He took risks with clients, customs, and competitors. Venice, for example." "Funny," I said. "He brought back a painting that disappeared the night he died." Menzo raised an eyebrow. "Was it insured?" "You tell me. You used to sell to the same buyers." He sipped. "Not anymore." I turned to go, but he stopped me with a lazy flick of his hand. "You know," he said, voice lower, "that frame, the one on Hartwell's painting. What about it? It should have stayed in Italy." And just like that, he gave me a motive, a lead, and a line that Wolfe would pounce on like Fritz on truffle oil. Mrs. Dubin lived in Queens and ran her building like a minor dictatorship. Her foyer smelled like onions and ammonia, and her hallway rugs had been vacuumed so aggressively they looked combed. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, not bothering to offer tea, "was a polite man, if not particularly tidy. But he was nervous, always checking the locks." "Did he have visitors?" I asked. She squinted. 3 days before he died, yes. A man, tall, foreign, smelled like paint thinner." "That's oddly specific." "I've been cleaning for 50 years, Mr. Goodwin. I know my solvents." "Anything else?" "He wore gloves, soft ones. Spoke Italian, I think. And his voice." She paused, glancing at the window like someone might be listening in. "His voice was soft, like a priest saying last rites." That gave me pause. Did he seem angry? No. Sad. She wrung her hands. He looked like someone who came to say goodbye, and meant it. That was more than gossip. That was a door cracking open, and it smelled a lot like murder. The tip came from Lon Cohen at the Gazette. "Your courier," he said, "was seen at Pier 47 last night, talking to a guy who didn't talk back." I headed down to the docks, which smelled like fish, gasoline, and regret. The wind bit harder near the water, and most of the warehouses looked like they'd folded during Prohibition and never got the memo to reopen.
No sign of Vittorio Ziletti. But behind a stack of crates near the rusted fence, I found something else. A glove, leather, Italian, still damp with turpentine, and monogrammed the letter V. I picked it up with a handkerchief, too soft for a dock worker, too expensive for a cleaning rag. No sign of blood, but the ground nearby was disturbed, like someone had stumbled, dropped something, or just disappeared. The glove was a warning, or a signature. I bagged it, made a mental note of the nearest sewer grate, and headed back to the brownstone. If Vittorio had
gone for a swim, I wanted Wolfe to know it wasn't accidental. And if he hadn't, I was probably next. Wolfe was halfway through his saffron risotto when I walked in. Fritz gave me a look that could wilt parsley, but I nodded and handed Wolfe the glove. He wiped his fingers, took it delicately, and turned it over. V, he said, for Vittorio. Or Venice, I offered. Both may apply. I gave him the rundown, Clara's cryptic admission, Menzo's slip about the frame, Mrs. Dubin's eerie recollection, and now the glove by the docks. Wolfe took it in with closed eyes and a pinched brow. He hated dinner interruptions, but he hated gaps in logic more. When I finished, he opened his eyes and looked at me like I'd just given him the first half of a perfect recipe. You will find this courier, if he's still above water. You will find him regardless, Wolfe said, alive or otherwise. He pushed back his plate and rose, which told me the risotto was over and the stakes were rising. This is no longer about art, he said. I nodded. What is it about? Ownership, Wolfe murmured. Then he turned, slowly, deliberately. And owners, he said, kill. I was halfway through a fresh cinnamon roll and a crossword puzzle that was winning when Lon Cohen's voice barged in on the phone line like it owned the place. She's in custody, Lon said, dry as a martini without the olive. Who's she? You're Miss Hartwell, arrested 30 minutes ago. One fingerprint, left index, matched on the latch of the crate where Hartwell's body was found. Kramer's got her down at the precinct. Wants a statement and a confession, preferably in that order. Now, I've had my morning buzz killed in many inventive ways, once by a dog with a limp and a grudge, but this one topped the list. One print? That's it? That's it, Lon said. The boys in blue are calling it ironclad, brass-knuckled at least. I hung up and stared at the phone like it had recited a dirty limerick. Wolfe wasn't going to like this. He might not even finish his trout. And sure enough, when I broke the news over the creamed mushrooms, the only thing that moved was Wolfe's eyebrow, and then his napkin. Something was about to erupt in the brownstone, and if I had any sense, I'd duck. But I didn't, because watching Wolfe go volcanic is part of the show. The napkin hit the table like a judge's gavel. Wolfe rose, a rare tectonic event, and glared in the general direction of the city of New York, or more specifically, Inspector Kramer. The glare could have blistered chrome. That is the caliber of intellect employed in our law enforcement establishment, he thundered. They have arrested a red herring, in pearls. You saw her pearls? I asked. Aye. He ignored me, which wasn't unusual, and paced precisely 12 steps before turning, his voice thick with contempt. One fingerprint, he said, on a crate. A crate touched by myself, by you, by the delivery men from Greco's Fine Imports, and by, evidently, Miss Hartwell. Yet the only print visible belongs to the woman least likely to have broken a man's neck and arranged him like a fig in a lunchbox. She was cuffed with confidence, I offered, channeling Lon. Archie, get me Kramer, or get me a flamethrower and his badge. I rose, dialing with the kind of calm that only comes from long experience. Wolfe hadn't even considered the possibility that Clara might be guilty, which meant someone had planted that fingerprint, and Wolfe had just decided he was going to torch whoever did it. I hoped Kramer brought oven mitts. Kramer arrived like a thunderstorm in cheap shoes. He stomped into the office, grumbling about subpoenas and spineless reporters, and fixed Wolfe with a stare that would have rattled the average houseplant. Wolfe, of course, was unmoved. He sat in the chair like it was a throne, and Kramer was the village idiot petitioning for a job. "You called me down here to squawk about a fingerprint," Kramer growled. "I summoned you," Wolfe corrected, "to address your flagrant abuse of logic, not to indulge your avian metaphors." I took my seat with a glass of cold milk and a front-row view. "She had motive," Kramer snapped. "She had no alibi. And now we've got her print. It's enough." "Enough for a man of limited ambition, perhaps," Wolfe replied. "But to those not yet embalmed by convenience, it reeks of orchestration." Kramer's eyes narrowed. "You accusing me of something?" "I am accusing you," Wolfe said, rising a fraction, "of treating a planted fingerprint as gospel truth. Your method, Inspector, is an invitation to intellectual rigor mortis, and the corpse is truth." Kramer's hand went to his belt, then thought better of it. I didn't blame him. This wasn't going to be a brawl. It was a dissection. After Kramer stormed out, muttering about judges and strangulation, I laid the box on Wolfe's desk. The crate in question had once housed a Brillat Savarin folio and a whole lot of trouble. Wolfe had handled it twice, once with his silk handkerchief, once without. I had manhandled it during the unpacking, but according to forensics, the only fingerprint worth noting was Clara's, right on the broken latch. "I'd be insulted," I said, "if they didn't erase me too." Wolfe leaned over, nostrils flaring. "A print on the latch," he murmured. "Singular, prominent, convenient." He inspected the wood with his fingertips, as if coaxing out a confession. "Do you recall handling the latch, Archie?" "Twice. Once when it jammed. Once when it unjammed. And yet, no trace." He nodded slowly. "It was planted, not to solve the crime, to close it expediently, neatly. And legally?" "Legal," Wolfe spat, "is a goat with a collar. Truth is the animal I pursue." I didn't say it, but I was starting to agree. Someone wanted the Hartwell case buttoned up, gift-wrapped and buried. But who benefits from closing a case when the painting and the real motive were still out there? Someone was very tidy. Too tidy. Fritz brought the tea like he was delivering a baby. Ceremonial, delicate, and probably more valuable than the suspect Kramer had in custody. Wolfe took his cup, sipped, and stared at the fireplace. When the sip turned into a sigh, I knew the gears were shifting. "She did not kill him," he said, more to the steam than to me. "You've made that pretty clear. But we must prove it. Let me guess. You want me to find out where she was the night of the murder?" He gave me a glance sharp enough to nick porcelain. "Correct. Track her steps. Verify each one. Expose the fallacies Inspector Kramer has so dutifully stapled into his report." "That's a lot of ground," I said. "Then start walking." He placed the cup down with the gravity of a man signing a death warrant. "You will begin with her apartment, speak to the doorman, her neighbors, her seamstress if she has one. Trace the minutes. Drag her out of the quicksand you dropped her in, Inspector," he added, loud enough that I suspected Kramer could feel it from the precinct. He lifted the cup again. "We will now do what you have failed to. Investigate." And just like that, the tide turned. The idea hit me somewhere between my fourth coffee and Fritz's grumble about lentils being underappreciated. I'd been to Hartwell's penthouse twice now, and both times I'd been too polite, too linear. That wasn't like me. So I told Wolfe I needed air and headed for the dead man's lair with nothing but a hunch and a lockpick I wasn't planning to use unless necessary. The super downstairs gave me the stink eye,
probably because I smiled too much. I played dumb and said I left a silk scarf behind. He muttered something about dames and buzzed me up. Hartwell's place hadn't changed. Still quiet, still expensive. But the wine rack in the far corner had something it didn't before. Dust. Not on the bottles. Behind them. I pulled the rack forward, and there it was. A canvas. No frame, no flare. Just a raw-backed, slightly warped stretch of old linen. It was nearly blank, just faint swirls of pigment. But there at the corner was a signature in tiny sepia ink. Bellini. That name rang bells, big ones. Wolfe once said Bellini was more prolific than Monet and twice as dishonest. A 19th century art forger whose fake Botticellis made the Vatican blush. I took the canvas, wrapped it in a towel, and got out before the super remembered I wasn't wearing a scarf. A blank Bellini behind Hartwell's wine rack? Yeah, I'd call that a clue, and maybe a very expensive one. The dust wasn't the only thing old and deliberate in that room. Wolfe barely looked up when I slid the canvas out like a magician pulling a rabbit from under a contract. "Behind the wine rack?" I said, real casual. "Signed by your friend Bellini." He sniffed, not at me, at the canvas, and leaned forward like it was a truffle he hadn't expected this season. "Bellini," he murmured, "was a master of deception, but a terrible colorist. Observe the balance, off by a quarter inch, and that," he pointed at the barely there figure, "is supposed to be St. Sebastian. He looks like a weary florist." Wolfe set the canvas down and stared at it the way a judge might look at a perjurer with an allergy to soap. Hartwell didn't hide this to protect anything. He hid it because he needed a decoy. He replaced the real portrait with this, then set up a swap, one here, one abroad. Double the sales, half the ethics. Exactly. He risked imprisonment not for profit, but to conceal the location of the true asset. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. A fake in New York. The original in Venice. A man does not tempt ruin unless the real prize is behind the canvas. And Wolfe, when he said behind, didn't just mean metaphorically. Clara arrived unannounced and looked like she'd lost a week's sleep and 2 pounds of dignity. I met her at the door and offered tea, which she declined, and then sherry, which she accepted. She perched on the edge of the red chair like it might eject her, and when Wolfe entered, she stood as if someone had rung a bell inside her spine. "I suppose you know," she said. "Suppose nothing," Wolfe replied. "State what you will." Her hands twisted in her lap like they were arguing. Uncle Paul had plans. He wasn't just selling a portrait. He had the original, wrapped, ready to ship. But he kept this other one here, a copy, a forgery. "By Bellini," I added, because sometimes I like to be helpful. She gave a small, surprised nod. "Yes. He told me he had a buyer in Manhattan for the fake, and another in Italy for the real one." "So he intended to deceive both," Wolfe said. "Typical." "He said the paint didn't matter," Clara whispered. "He said the value was in the wood." Wolfe's nostrils flared. "In the wood?" She nodded. "The back of the frame. He said it held something no one else had seen in centuries." I didn't like the sound of that. Paintings are trouble, but paintings with secrets in the frame, that's the kind of trouble that gets people dead. Wolfe lectured with the tone of a man who once scolded Aristotle for slouching. "In the 16th century," he began, "Florentine artisans constructed frames not merely as ornamentation, but as concealment. Panels were hollowed, backings were fitted with false seams, letters, titles, even papal correspondences were hidden within.
I nodded like a schoolboy and flipped through a cigar
catalogue for balance. Wolfe ignored the insult. One such frame, he continued, was rumoured to contain a sealed deed from the Medici to a Venetian shipping guild, never recovered. Another supposedly held a Templar cipher. And what about the Mona Lisa? I asked. Got a sandwich in hers? That, Wolfe said, is puerile. He leaned forward, eyes glinting behind half-lowered lids. If Hartwell discovered a relic, perhaps a deed, a papal note, or even a royal claim, hidden within that frame, he would have every incentive to fabricate a painting around it. The forgery sells above board. The original, with its hidden truth, is smuggled. And someone found out, I said. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Find the original frame, Wolfe said at last, and you find the motive for murder. It wasn't about art anymore. It was about legacy, and maybe treason. I found Menzo at his Midtown gallery, puffing on a clove cigar that smelled like despair and damp curtains. He smiled like he owned the room, which he didn't, technically. Back again? He asked. You must really hate modern art. I've developed a taste for lies with brushstrokes, I said. Tell me something, Menzo. Ever heard of Bellini? His eyes danced, but his mouth stayed dry. 19th century charlatan, fakes all over Europe, brilliant touch, bad ethics. Sounds familiar. I let the silence stretch until he blinked. Know anything about a little treasure Hartwell kept? Something, maybe, Venetian? He laughed, too fast. What, like a gondola? No, I said, like a document. Hidden. Valuable. Worth killing for. Menzo's smile thinned. Hartwell had secrets. All artists do. But if he had a treasure... He spread his hands. Not everything stays buried in Italy. He said it too easily, like someone who'd rehearsed. I left with more questions than answers and a faint scent of patchouli in my coat. But I'd caught it, the twitch. Menzo knew about the frame, maybe more. The question wasn't whether he knew. It was whether he'd already gotten to it. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe barely waited for Fritz to serve the beer before he spoke. It is all rather elegant in its way, he said. Hartwell sold a forgery in New York, shipped the real painting abroad, but the true prize wasn't either painting, it was what the frame concealed. I nodded. And someone wanted that frame badly enough to kill. Indeed, Wolfe said. A con within a con, an art forgery hiding a historical secret. He closed his eyes and murmured, Mr. Goodwin, someone killed not for art, but for ownership. Ownership of what, I wondered, and who else knew? If Fritz was humming, something was either about to be served or about to explode. That evening he was humming Verdi and shaving black truffles like they'd offended him personally. You might tell me, I said, leaning on the kitchen door frame. What's the occasion? Unless the Italian government is dining with us and I missed the memo. Fritz grinned, an actual full set of molars, and said, Mr. Wolfe requested Piemonte duck, truffle risotto, and chestnut tarts. It is not my business to question divine strategy. No, but it was mine. Wolfe didn't set menus like that unless he wanted bellies full and tongues loose. I wandered back to the office and found Wolfe nestled in his chair, eyes closed, lips moving. Prayer or plotting, flip a coin. You planning to wine and dine our way to a confession? I asked. He opened one eye. Mr. Goodwin, appetite dulls anxiety, excess dulls discretion. Both will serve. Outside, the rain had started to tap the windows like a nervous stenographer. Inside, the air smelled of roasted duck and entrapment.
Wolfe murmured. They will speak more freely with duck fat in their blood. Sure, and maybe choke on the truth along with the dessert. The dining room looked like a Renaissance peace summit, minus the peace. Clara wore a pale lavender dress and an expression that could curdle milk. Menzo strutted in like a museum curator forced to visit a buffet. Mrs. Dubin fluttered like a wounded wren, and the last chair was filled by a courier whose name I never caught, but whose tie looked like it had been ironed with a spoon. Wolfe welcomed them with the grandeur of a minor pope and waved toward the table. Fritz had laid it out with surgical precision, silver cutlery gleaming like scalpels, candlelight soft enough to reveal lies without scaring them off, and plates that steam sang their seduction. "If you please," Wolfe said, "I believe in digestion as a prelude to revelation." The guests dug in, slowly. Clara played with her risotto like it might explode. Menzo asked for wine before water. The courier spoke only when his fork wasn't busy. I sat silent, watching hands twitch, eyes flick, and knives move a little too quickly through soft meat. Wolfe raised his glass midway through the secondo. "To stolen legacies and second helpings," he said. Everyone drank, except Mrs. Dubin, who coughed, then smiled too hard. And I'll say this. If Wolfe had wanted a round table of discomfort, he got it. But the trick wasn't who stabbed who with words. It was who'd pick the wrong one and bleed. If Wolfe had ever joined the State Department, half the wars in Europe would have been settled over consommé. That night, he weaponized conversation like a master swordsman, parrying with puff pastry. "I've always found the notion of Venetian art theft fascinating," he began, as if discussing tulip bulbs. Menzo grunted. Clara's fork paused mid-air. The courier dabbed at his mouth like it owed him money. "And the laws on transatlantic shipping," Wolfe continued, "so arcane. Did you know the customs inspection rate for outbound crates is lower than inbound? Remarkable." "Is it?" Menzo asked, brittle as biscotti. Wolfe nodded, then sighed. "The myth of hollow frames persists, of course. Smuggling contraband behind canvas. More
Fiction than fact, unless one is clever." Mrs. Dubin muttered something about the Da Vinci Code and looked apologetic. Wolfe leaned forward just slightly. "Of course, Mr. Hartwell's final shipment manifest, filed the day he died, listed an antique frame, unmounted. An odd item to export, wouldn't you say?" The courier's hand slipped. A half glass of Chianti went tumbling down the front of his shirt like a confession in red ink. "Apologies," he stammered. Wolfe didn't blink, and I didn't miss it, the first drop of wine on a table that was about to stain. By the time the chestnut tarts arrived, Giorgio Menzo's face had the consistency of stale toast, browned, dry, and one poke away from crumbling. He stabbed his tart with a bit too much flair and said, "You Americans never deserved that painting." Silence is a powerful condiment. Wolfe used it liberally. So did Clara, who turned to stone at Menzo's words. Mrs. Dubin blinked like someone just turned off the sun. I said, casually, "That's a strong opinion for a guy who claims he didn't know the painting existed." Menzo waved his fork. "Art belongs to its culture, to its soil, not to museums or penthouses." "And murder?" Wolfe asked. "Does that belong to any particular soil?" Menzo looked at him, and for 1 second something flickered. Maybe guilt, maybe pride. Hard to tell with men who smile when they lose money, but not when they gain morality. Then he bit into the tart and chewed like a man savouring his own last act. Wolfe dropped his napkin. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, "make the calls. Midnight. My office." I didn't argue. When Wolfe calls for midnight,
It isn't because he's lonely. It's because someone's fate has just been penciled into his ledger. After the guests left, some with pleasantries, one with a wine-stained tie, we returned to the office where the real digestion began. Wolfe eased himself into his chair like a man entering a courtroom he owns. I pulled out my notebook. "Your observations?" he asked. I flipped a page. Courier was sweating like a butcher in a confessional. Clara didn't touch her tart. Menzo through his loyalty to the flag of Italy and the grave of Hartwell. Wolfe nodded. Mrs. Dubin kept up the act, wide-eyed and whispery. Either she's scared stiff or she's got the best poker face east of Vegas. Wolfe laced his fingers. It's irrelevant. Excuse me? I said, Wolfe repeated. The frame is irrelevant now. The man gave himself away with a syllable. I waited. A man who claims ignorance of an object does not assign ownership by saying that painting. He says the painting or your painting, not that, not with contempt. He leaned back, eyes closing. That word, Mr. Goodwin, was his mistake, and our conclusion. He said no more. But in that stillness, the trap closed. And I knew, by dawn, someone's story would be hanging on the wall, and it wouldn't be art. It was midnight, and the brownstone smelled faintly of roasted duck and aftershave. Wolfe had summoned the entire cast, Clara, Menzo, Mrs. Dubin, and the courier whose name still hadn't stuck in my brain, to the office under the noble guise of final clarification. Me? I was parked at my desk with a notebook, a Colt in the drawer, and a pretty good idea something was about to give. Clara looked like she hadn't slept in days, clutching her purse like it contained a confession. Menzo was coiled, pretending to be bored, which for my money is the first sign of panic in a European art dealer. Mrs. Dubin fluttered her lashes like a moth near a porchlight. And the courier? Still mute, but his knuckles were white around his hat. Wolfe leaned back in the red chair, fingers pressed into a steeple. He hadn't moved since they'd entered, and that was part of the theatre. The silence worked like varnish, slow, thick, revealing grain. "You are here," Wolfe began, his voice as smooth as port wine, "because something has been stolen. Again." And just like that, we were off. Wolfe didn't rise. He rarely did. But his voice did the work of a grand entrance. "The portrait currently in Miss Dubin's possession," he said, "is authentic. The painting on display in Mr. Hartwell's penthouse was not." Clara jolted upright. But how? Please, the interruptions do not benefit the truth." Wolfe gestured toward a document I'd already placed on the desk, an import record for Hartwell's last art shipment. "The forgery," Wolfe continued, "was painted by Vellini, a man whose oeuvre includes 77 known fakes and one accidental masterpiece. He worked fast, signed faster, and died with a paintbrush in one hand and a counterfeit tax bill in the other." Menzo made a noise that could have been a cough or a curse. Wolfe adjusted his cuffs. Hartwell knew the original was dangerous, not because of the portrait, but because of what it enclosed. By swapping it with a Vellini imitation, he purchased time. He could stage the piece publicly, appear transparent, while arranging transport of the real item quietly. "Why would he do that?" Clara asked. Wolfe turned his head, owl-like. "Because, Miss Dubin, Hartwell did not fear the painting being stolen. He feared the frame being discovered." Now that landed. Even Menzo blinked. A frame, I thought, that someone else had already discovered. Wolfe raised a hand, palm outward. "Mr. Goodwin, the envelope." I passed him the cream-coloured packet. No label, no flourish. Inside was a high-resolution scan Wolfe had acquired with Kramer's reluctant help and a phone call to Interpol. The original frame, Wolfe said, holding up the image, contained a folded deed, sealed in wax, written in Venetian dialect, dated 1764. "Impossible," Mrs. Dubin breathed. "Not at all," Wolfe replied. The painting was encased in a Renaissance frame, a true one, not a mock Baroque replica. Such frames were known to hold compartments. During the Austro-Hungarian skirmishes, landowners often hid their titles inside artworks to protect them from seizure. "And this deed?" Clara asked, voice barely above a whisper. "To a villa in the Veneto, on the Brenta Canal, assumed destroyed by shelling in 1944. But last month," he nodded toward me, "Mr. Goodwin verified the foundation still stands, and the title, recognized under modern property law, would render its owner quite wealthy." "A castle," I said, "hidden in gilded wood." Wolfe sniffed. "Not quite a castle, but sufficiently grand to inspire murder." Menzo looked away. The courier shifted. Wolfe tapped the image. "A man doesn't forge art for profit. He does it to stall. While he moves, while he buys time, while he claims land. And Hartwell, for all his ambition, didn't move fast enough." We were one breath away from the trap snapping shut. "You said something, Mr. Menzo." Wolfe turned slightly. "At dinner. Something no one else could have said unless they had seen the original frame before Mr. Hartwell's demise." Menzo's fingers drummed the armrest. "Did I?" I stood. Not threatening, just tall. "You called it," Wolfe continued, "a Venetian treasure. A phrase Hartwell never used aloud and certainly never published." "Coincidence," Menzo muttered. "Poetic license." Wolfe's brows arched. "Did your license also grant access to the private ledger Hartwell kept, the one noting an attempted frame restoration, cancelled abruptly after a visit from you?" Menzo's mouth twitched. He looked at the courier. The courier looked at the floor. "I don't know what you think I saw," Menzo said, "but you're mistaken." "No," Wolfe said softly. "I am not." He leaned forward, a rare thing. "You killed for a deed, Mr. Menzo, and in the process signed your own." I didn't say it, but in that moment the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Wolfe launched into it with the tone of a man reciting an opera's final act. The plan was elegant. First, steal the original frame after Hartwell removed it for what he claimed was inspection. He was smart enough not to tell anyone why, but Menzo knew. He had seen the slight gap between panel and wood, noted the crude putty touch-ups, perhaps even heard the slight rattle that told of a hollow space. Wolfe paused. Next, replace the frame with a replica Hartwell had commissioned for insurance display. That, too, was intercepted. Mrs. Dubin raised a hand, then dropped it. Then, Wolfe continued, the murder. Hartwell died not from trauma, but from a timed release capsule slipped into his aperitif the night before. A capsule soaked in bitter almond oil, masked with cinnamon. I looked up from my notes. That tracks. Wolfe nodded. A capsule the size and shape of a vitamin, easy to conceal, even easier to dismiss. And then the fingerprint on the canvas, Clara's, transferred by glove, a left-handed smear at an unnatural angle. I opened my drawer and pulled out a glove. Light brown suede. I held it up. Guess whose paint thinner matched the crate this was found in? The courier didn't answer. But the clincher, Wolfe said, was the monogram. V, not for victory, but for Velini. The courier's face went slack. Menzo let out a sigh. It was too perfect. No, Wolfe corrected, it was too arrogant. And that was the difference between a copycat and a connoisseur of crime. Clara's mouth moved, but no sound came out. She dropped into the red velvet chair like a marionette whose strings had been cut. Menzo, by contrast, stood tall for a man unraveling. "I never meant to kill him," he said quietly. "Only to frighten him, push him off the deal. He wasn't the rightful heir. He found the deed by accident." "Perhaps," Wolfe said, "but he paid for it in full." "You don't understand," Menzo hissed. "I spent years chasing that frame. I tracked it across Paris, Florence, a farmhouse in Vicenza. I knew it had to be the one. The markings matched. The joints were right. I just needed time." "Time," Wolfe echoed, "was Hartwell's to spend, not yours." The courier muttered something in Italian, probably a prayer. That's when Kramer entered, rumpled, red-eyed, and not particularly gentle. He took one look at Menzo and said, "You're under arrest. Try not to faint. I just had this tie cleaned." Menzo didn't resist. He just looked down. As the door closed behind them, Clara finally spoke. "And the villa?" Wolfe turned away. "Now belongs to the state. The dead cannot inherit." And with that, the final stroke landed, neither painted nor forged, but carved in truth. Kramer stood there like a bull that had just charged the wrong matador. His face, never exactly a pastel, had gone a vivid shade somewhere between rhubarb and rage. The veins on his neck were trying to file a grievance. I was tempted to offer him a paper bag and a seat, but I enjoy breathing. "You've got to be kidding me, Wolfe," he barked, stabbing a finger in the general direction of Menzo, who was now pretending the wallpaper was fascinating. "I rarely jest, Inspector," Wolfe replied, without looking up from the monogrammed paper he was folding with glacial calm. "Jesting is a frivolity reserved for men with no skin in the game." "Skin? He poisoned a man, tampered with evidence, and forged a painting. I should cuff you for obstruction." I half rose in my chair. Not because I wanted to stop him, just to make sure he didn't knock over anything expensive in the process. "You should, but you won't," Wolfe said mildly, "because the evidence now presented makes your earlier hypothesis untenable. I suggest redirecting your zeal toward a successful prosecution rather than an emotional tantrum." Kramer opened his mouth, then closed it again, clearly recalibrating whether blowing a gasket in Wolfe's office would help his ulcer or feed it. "You know what?" he growled. "I'm done. But if this goes sideways in court, it's your smug neck I'm coming for." He turned, stomped to the door, and slammed it so hard the orchids trembled on their hooks. From the hallway came a strangled gasp. Fritz. 5 minutes later, Clara Dubin reappeared in the office, minus the righteous fury, plus a folder under one arm and an expression that had grown roots in some private sorrow. She sat in the green chair, always the one on the left, as if she couldn't bring herself to face Wolfe straight on, and placed the folder gently on the edge of his desk, like it might explode. "I've made my decision," she said. "Two, actually." Wolfe peered at her, then reached for his beer instead of the folder. "Proceed." "I'm donating the portrait to the Met. Not a loan, a gift. No tax write-off, no plaque with my name. Just let it belong to everyone now." "That," Wolfe said, "is uncharacteristically altruistic." "I didn't say it was easy," she replied. Archie's rule of thumb. When someone says they're doing something noble and looks like they just swallowed a cactus, believe them. "And the deed?" I asked. She hesitated. "I'm returning it to the Italian government, the property, the history, the whole mess. Let them decide what to do with it." Wolfe blinked, which for him is equivalent to gasping. "That is generous to the point of lunacy." Clara smiled, the tired kind. "Maybe.
but I don't want a castle I can't walk into without hearing a scream." She rose, smoothed her coat, and turned to go. At the door, she paused and laid a small envelope on the side table. "It's addressed," she said, "to the man who really solved it." She meant Wolfe, but her eyes were on me. The envelope sat untouched for a good 3 minutes, long enough for Wolfe to refill his beer and Fritz to hover like a butler with stage fright. When Wolfe finally slit it open, using his gold-handled letter opener, naturally, it wasn't a check or a letter of thanks. It was a book, thin, faded, bound in worn leather that looked like it had once belonged to a modestly successful alchemist. Wolfe's lips twitched. Le Goût du Sanglier, 1789 edition, annotated by the Duc de Lévis-Mirepoix. "Oh boy," I muttered. "He's gonna need a minute." Fritz stepped forward, reverently, as if Wolfe were holding the Grail. His eyes scanned the margins, ink faded but legible, and I swear the man teared up. "She found it," Wolfe said. "I told her it likely didn't exist, and she found it." "Don't thank her too loud," I said. "You'll pull something." He ignored me, naturally, but set the book on his lap like a lap dog. He stared at it, then lifted his glass. "This," he said solemnly, "almost redeems humanity." Almost. I leaned back in my chair and let the silence thicken. Outside, the city throbbed as usual. Horns, sirens, someone arguing with gravity. Wolfe took another sip of beer. And me? I thought about the dead man, the forged painting, the woman who chose honesty over a castle, and the stubborn genius beside me reading about boar stew. The castle may have stood over a Venetian lake, but the real swamp was right here in Manhattan. And Wolfe, of course, waded in only because he smelled a rare truffle. By the time Wolfe retired to his orchids and Fritz had tiptoed off to ponder dessert, the office felt like a crime scene after the clean-up crew had already gone home. Papers, photos, a single glove, and a whole lot of conjecture were scattered across Wolfe's desk like remnants of a very intellectual tornado. I started gathering it all up, not because I enjoy tidying, but because clutter gives me hives. Funny how it always ends the same. Someone dead, someone guilty, Wolfe smug, and me left playing maid with a revolver in my drawer. I folded the confession, the sketch of the fake painting's underlayer, and a receipt from a bodega that somehow cracked the timeline wide open. All neatly stacked into a manila folder labeled Miss Homicidal Art Hoaxes. As I reached for the crate, the same one the velvet monstrosity had arrived in, I tapped its wooden frame with my knuckle. Hollow, like most of the people involved in this case. It had all started with a man who believed ghosts could appreciate velvet. Not taste, not evidence, not revenge. Ghosts. And somehow we'd ended with truth, justice, and a French cookbook. I stared at the now empty crate. No painting, no secrets, just wood, nails, and the faintest whiff of lavender varnish. "Funny," I said out loud, though no one was around. Something that arrived full of ghosts left empty, with truth packed in its place. And because I'm me, I added, not bad for a week's work. Dinner, when it came, smelled like atonement. Fritz had outdone himself. The Zabaglione was airy enough to qualify as celestial, and the espresso. Let's just say if Italy ever invades Manhattan, it won't be for Wall Street. Wolfe sat at the head of the table, plump and content, his lips stained faintly from the Barolo, his eyes half-lidded, not with fatigue, but with what passes for contentment in a man who trusts no one and nothing except cheese, books, and his own brain. He spooned up the last bite of custard with the same gravitas a bishop reserves for communion. Then he dabbed his mouth and looked at me like I was an undercooked theory. "You understand, of course," he began,
that the essence of the deception wasn't artistic, it was emotional. The killer knew that people, especially wealthy people, don't want art. They want meaning, history,
Mystery. So they faked both? I asked. They concocted both, he corrected. The frame was hollow, the story around it elaborate enough to tempt even me. And yet you didn't leave your chair. He took a sip of espresso and sneered. Travel? Bah! Too many idiots abroad. I raised my cup in mock salute. Here's to solving murders from home. To civilization, he muttered. Then he leaned back, sighed, and closed his eyes. Not asleep. Not quite. And in that moment, I realized the only thing sharper than Wolfe's tongue was his appetite, for food, for truth, and for being right. The frame was hollow. The killer was not, he murmured. That is all. Some cases end in sirens, others in silence. This one? In Zabaglione and Velvet Ashes. After Wolfe retreated to the plant kingdom and Fritz disappeared into the kitchen, I stayed behind in the office, leaning back in my chair and letting the afternoon city hum fill the cracks. Even murder in Manhattan has a rhythm if you listen close. I thought about the castle, the whispers, the ridiculous painting that was worth more for the lie than the brushstrokes. About Clara, who chose clarity over legacy. About Menzo, who'd wanted immortality but got infamy instead. And, of course, about Wolfe. You'd think after all this time I'd stop being surprised. But every now and then he tosses out a phrase or a pause that feels like he's cutting open the universe with a butter knife. He'd never say it out loud, but he gets people, right down to their greedy, ghost-believing bones. As for me, I still don't believe in ghosts. Not the floating kind, anyway, but the ones people carry. Inherited shame, gilded guilt, secrets in oil paint. Those I see every day. I turned off the light, let the silence thicken, and tapped the side of the empty crate one last time. The castle may have stood over a Venetian lake, but the real swamp was right here in Manhattan. And Wolfe, of course, waded in only because he smelled a rare truffle. In the quiet that follows a confession, even the orchids seem to breathe easier. A deed hidden in a gilded frame, a forgery passed as truth, a life taken not in fury, but in calculation. Justice, when it finally arrived, did so in silence, with Wolfe's voice the only gavel needed. And yet, beneath the logic and the law, something more lingers. Questions of greed, legacy, and the fragile beauty of what we choose to preserve. Do you believe the killer truly had a choice? Or was he already trapped the moment he touched the frame? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes.